BMW and the DTM, it seems a natural fit. The manufacturer had huge history in Germany's top racing series, yet that Bavarian manufacturer had also been absent from the series since 1995. But in 2011, it was announced that all of that was about to change. BMW was returning to the DTM, and its new car had the potential to dramatically change the whole of international motor racing. This is the story of the BMW M3 DTM and how it created Class 1. BMW wanted to rejoin the DTM, and ITR, the DTM organisers, were desperate for them to return. Opel had quit the series at the end of the 2005 season, leaving just Audi and Mercedes as the only manufacturers contesting the championship. A proposed entry by MG in 2005 never happened, and parts of the wind tunnel model for that car ended up on eBay. We might have to revisit that in future. A Lexus prototype called the ISF Racing Concept was tested, but it never seemed like a serious DTM entry. However, there were also rumours of interest from Nissan in the DTM as well. Nissan, though, insisted that if it were to enter the DTM, and it didn't officially have any plans to do so, it would want to be able to race the DTM car in other championships. The implication was clear. It wanted DTM to have common regulations with either Super GT or IMSA, or even both. BMW had also openly called for the same, and the German car maker also wanted costs to be cut significantly in the DTM. Quietly, a new rulebook for the 2012 DTM season had been agreed in Germany, and under these new rules, every single car contesting that championship would use an identical common chassis. That chassis was mostly designed by Mercedes, and it was a single-make carbon fibre tub with a roll cage on top of it. As an aside, this new common chassis and wider car concept was designed to accommodate a hybrid system, but that was never used in the DTM, but we will probably come back to that. Each car maker could design a body to suit the chassis, though it would have to have been based on a two-door coupe rather than a four-door saloon car, or sedan as the Americans might call it, as had been the case previously. BMW chose to use the E92 M3 model as the basis of its new DTM car. The monocoque chassis would also accommodate the 120-litre fuel cell, and the whole chassis weighed about 126 kilograms, with the tubular roll cage adding another 32.5 kilos on top of that. The shared parts of the cars would go way beyond that though. Almost the entire mechanical package would be common to every single car, with each manufacturer taking primary responsibility for a number of parts to be developed. Mercedes did the chassis and the front, side and rear crash structures. Audi, on the other hand, was responsible for the gearbox, the prop shaft and the drive shaft, while BMW took charge of the steering system, the fuel system and the electronics. The result of all of this was a front-engined car with double wishbone suspension all round with pushrod actuated dampers. Other parts were also restricted to single supplier, single design, and the brakes, the clutch, the dampers, and even the wheels and tyres were all restricted to being spec components. The transmission of the cars was supplied by Hewland. It was a transfer 6-speed gearbox and featured semi-automatic paddle shifters in place of the sequential gear lever used on the previous generation of DTM cars. There was also a little freedom in terms of the suspension design. While the dampers were one-make parts and some of the pickup points were tightly defined, and the uprights as well were common parts, manufacturers could still develop their own kinematics. The geometry and the wishbones were all completely free. The wheelbase, though, was quite tightly restricted. It had to remain between 2,740mm and 2,760mm, so just 20mm of freedom in terms of the wheelbase of the car. And similarly, the track of the car was set between 1,944mm and 1,956mm, just 12mm of freedom there. The aerodynamic package of the car was also very tightly restricted, even though the cars had that wild DTM look, but each manufacturer did have some technical freedom there. The width, height and length of the car were all identical between the manufacturers, and the bodies must also be proportionally identical to the basic road car, but the dimensions of that standard shape had to be stretched or shrunk according to a set of equations defined in the regulation. Generally, this worked quite well, apart from maybe the Aston Martin that turned up later, but that's another story. Notably, the cars were all significantly smaller than the old generation of cars. The wider aerodynamic regulations were much stricter than the previous generation of cars. Underfloor tunnels were banned, and through-car airflow was also outlawed, other than to cool specific components under the bodywork. The rear wing on the cars was a standard part used on all cars. Looking at the car from the side, there were essentially two areas of the car that were divided by an imaginary line running along the top of the wheel arches and about half halfway down the door. Above this line, the standard body shape of the car must be used in essentially uninterrupted form, although it has been squished and pulled to fit the DTM template. The only freedom above the line, in fact, was the bonnet surface and the wing mirrors. Below that line, there was, though, quite a bit of freedom, and that's why you get those wild DTM looks with this generation of car. However, once the manufacturers had completed these designs, they would be fully homologated and locked in for 2 seasons with no potential for any further aerodynamic development during that time. BMW initially worked with a 50% scale model in its own rolling road wind tunnel in Germany and then progressed to full-scale testing. Extensive CFD work was also conducted, and the 2 streams of development were combined to ensure that BMW had the best aerodynamic package possible within those regulations. However, even with so much of the car defined tightly by the regulations and the aerodynamic work well underway at BMW, the German manufacturer was still missing something absolutely crucial: an engine. Audi and Mercedes wanted to continue using their 4-litre normally aspirated V8s, which they'd been using for almost a decade at that point. These engines also had been frozen in specification for a very, very long time. BMW, though, would have to develop a completely new engine to meet the same specifications. The rules stated that the block and heads must be all aluminium, and many other areas of the engine development, such as the bore spacing, the crank position, and all of the component materials were very tightly defined in the rules. Even the gudgeon pin diameter was defined at 47mm, so once BMW had its new engine finished, its specification was also frozen. But that wasn't quite the end of the story. BMW had at one point looked at using a production-based block on its new DTM engine, but there were no suitable base engines in BMW's range. The reason for this were that the regulations were so old that none of BMW's then current engine models were suitable to build to such an outdated rulebook. Even then, the other manufacturers were a little wary of BMW's arrival, and some of them had even suggested that BMW would have a distinct advantage with its new engine, as it would have been designed using simulation tools and machining techniques that were not available when Audi and Mercedes developed their V8s almost a decade earlier. But BMW countered this and said that it was actually at a disadvantage, as it didn't have as much experience with this sort of engine as its rivals did. In the end, though, it all seemed fairly even. Reliability was a key objective for BMW, as the manufacturer would only have a limited number of engines to use between its entire fleet of cars, and changes for reliability reasons, like in Formula 1, were simply not permitted in the DTM. At the first test of the BMW, it was found that it was 200 kilograms overweight, and it was the same story for the Audi and Mercedes, so the common parts package had to be substantially revised, and this weight-saving process, while effective eventually, increased costs significantly, and this was a big problem, as cost-cutting was one of the key objectives of these new cars. In 2012, the BMW DTM cars were believed to have cost the German company around €880,000, significantly more than the originally forecasted €500,000 that the new cars were intended to cost. But this, though, still represented a reduction over the previous generation of cars. It was felt, though, that these costs would only be acceptable to BMW's board if the cars could be raced outside of Europe. But where? BMW sent its forecast costs, the €500,000 for the new DTM rules chassis, to a number of organisations around the world, including NASCAR in the USA, as well as GTA in Japan, the organisers of Super GT, and they received a cautiously positive response from both. Tentative talks soon began about a brand new 9-manufacturer international racing class starting up. Mercedes, Audi and BMW would take part from the DTM, Nissan, Honda and Toyota would take part from Super GT, and there were talks discussing Dodge, Chevrolet and Ford from NASCAR. All of these separate series would be running the same cars built to the same rules, and this was the real start of Class 1. The BMW M3 DTM was a strong competitor. It won both the Teams and Drivers' Championship in 2012, and it was second in both in 2013. However, for 2014, it was all changed. BMW replaced the M3 with a brand new car, the M4. It was, though, the arrival of BMW and the M3 DTM that sparked the creation expansion of Class 1 and ultimately resulted in Super GT and DTM having at least one dream race, even if the BMW M3 never took part in that event. This German car, which only ever contested the DTM, actually changed Super GT forever and resulted directly in one of the most interesting cars to ever contest Super GT being built. But we will get back to that. Power of dreams and all of that. If you've enjoyed this small Bavarian slice of German motorsport history, then stay tuned as there's a grosser amount more to come. But for now, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Bitte.